And joining us now on the debate, in London, UK, Juliette Michelson, Senior Researcher at the Center for Wellbeing at the New Economics Foundation. In Washington, D.C., Carol Graham, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and David Rothkopf, President and CEO of the advisory firm Garton Rothkopf. In Vancouver, British Columbia, John Helliwell, Co-Director of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research's program on social interactions, identity, and well-being at UBC. And with us here in studio, Mark Fetterman, who's a Dean at the Adler Graduate Professional School in Toronto. Great to have, Mark, you here back in studio, and to all of our guests on the line and Points Beyond, it's a pleasure to have you with us as well. I want to set up the discussion that we're about to have by reading the following that was in The Nation magazine earlier this year. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister David Cameron recently directed the Office for National Statistics to conduct a nationwide survey asking citizens what they believe should be used to measure happiness, with the goal of formulating policy focused not just on the bottom line, but on all those things that make life worthwhile. In Germany, the Bundestag has established a commission on growth, prosperity, quality of life to develop a more holistic measure of progress. Reforms are underway in Italy, Australia, South Korea, Canada, and the United States, where a project called State of the USA, supported by the National Academy of Sciences and numerous prominent foundations, has begun to track some alternative indicators of progress, which will eventually be accessible to citizens online. Juliette, let's start with you. What has prompted the current search by various governments for a new way of measuring progress?
Well, in some ways, it's a very old thought. Bobby Kennedy, back in the 60s, made a famous speech where he talked about the problems of GDP, our usual measure of economic growth, not capturing those things which make life worthwhile. And it's taken most politicians, I'd say, a little time to catch up. But the basic thought is that we've got very used to using economic indicators like GDP as a proxy for the overall progress of our countries. And what we actually know, and have known in more detail since a growing body of research on well-being in the last few decades, is that that only gives us a very partial picture.
David Rothkopf, do you think the so-called Great Recession has prompted people to look for new ways of measuring progress?
Well, I think it may have. I even think the decade before it may have, because, during the last decade, for example, the United States had a lot of growth. But we also had the first decade in American history where we actually didn't create a net new job, and we had the first decade in a long time in which we saw median incomes decline by an average of 7%. So if you looked at the GDP, you would say, oh, things aren't so bad. But if you looked at the real lives of Americans, you would say things are lousy and they're getting worse and inequality was growing. And so I think when you have a dissonance like that, you do have a kind of a resurgence of interest in finding alternative ways to do the math.
Let me follow up with you by reading something you put in the New York Times just last month, 2 months ago. Here in America, we seem to be more interested in finishing first than we are in figuring out what race we ought to be in. The refrain is insistent from President Obama on down. He, like others in both parties, urges us on to build or educate or invest or cut the deficit so that America can be number one again. We want to be number one, but why? And at what? The size of our economy is one measure of success, but it's not the only measure. Isn't the important question not how we remain number one, but rather what we want to be best at, and even whether we want to lead at all? Can you tell me, David, whether that conversation's happening in your country right now?
I think it's starting, and I think one of your other guests, Carol Graham's been leading the way in that conversation here in this country. There's beginning of a debate about whether we should use new metrics and what metrics to use. And I think there's a sense that however we've been scoring this, it's working for a tiny fragment of the population, but the dashboard that leaders are following isn't actually leading this country in a direction that's beneficial for the vast majority of people in this country.
Okay, Carol, that's a good intro for you. Over to you. Why do we need this new way of measuring progress?
Well, I think David and others have made the point that GNP measures is one indicator of progress, and yet if we look at our societies, look worldwide, there are all kinds of other aspects of quality of life, everything from people's health to the distribution of income to how clean the air is, to all sorts of other things that GNP doesn't really measure very well. And well-being metrics, we have a range of them. Happiness is the colloquial term, but these metrics allow us to measure the effects of everything from commuting time to air quality to stable partnerships on citizens' well-being. And I think that gives us a much broader picture of how particular societies are doing, how individuals within them are doing, and how societies compare with each other in a very different way from just the who's number one in GDP measure.
So John Helliwell, are we at a point now where you think governments, economists, non-governmental organizations, everybody, do we all need to just replace the GDP as the lead indicator of how well we're doing?
We're adding new measures, not taking away old ones, I think. GDP will remain. It's well documented. It's very good at what it does. It could be better. But what we're now saying is that there are many more aspects to people's lives than and nations' successes than the narrowly economic, and we can add without subtracting.
Add without subtracting. Okay, Mark, in that case, help us out with a bit. We've had a bit of a list advanced already on the program, but help us out with a more thorough list. If not the narrow, summation of goods and services produced in the country as the lead indicator of how we're doing, what else should we be measuring?
We should be measuring overall wellness and health. We should be measuring citizen engagement with process. Citizens are engaged, it means they're interested, it means that they have something vested in the country as opposed to sitting back, taking a passive role. We should be measuring how people are looking towards the future, whether they're making plans for the future, whether they're planning to advance their lives, to improve, to engage in arts, in music.
You can measure this kind of thing?
These are measurable qualitatively. We've been focused very much in society on quantitative measures, numbers that reduce very complex human endeavors to one number. The problem with that is it's an abstraction, and it really doesn't capture the nuances of the complexity of human society. And that's something that now in the 21st century, where the world is tremendously complex, we need to be able to start taking into consideration.
I would also think, John Helliwell, that it would be difficult to get the whole world, or at least a significant enough chunk of it, to agree on what well-being even means. Is that true?
Well, I think the agreement, when it comes, there's a lot of science on this as to what kinds of measures you ought to get. 20 or 30 years ago, there was the social indicators movement of people getting together a lot of metrics about quality of people's lives, presumed quality of people's lives. It never really got currency because it couldn't be translated or mixed with other things. What's new now is that we get measures of people evaluating their life as a whole, and then we can start figuring out what role economic and social and other variables play in explaining the overall quality of people's lives. So that's upped the pace and quality of the game enormously, and that's probably the big game changer. Within that, of course, people are now asking what sorts of subjective measures of well-being ought to be collected, the overall life evaluations, the moods now or yesterday. And we're finding when the different measures get collected, they tell a very coherent, consistent story. So not everybody needs to collect everything. There are international organizations working now on designing best practice and agreed practice methods for collecting these measures, just as was done 50 years ago for GDP accounting.
Well, let's get the story from across the pond. Yeah, sorry, was that you, Carol, who wanted to get in there?
Yes, I just wanted to add something to John's, I think, good summary statement, but that I think that we're very clear as in terms of developing these metrics that there are different elements of well-being that should be measured, and we know how to measure them. And so we want to know how people experience their daily lives, what their daily experience is like, something we call hedonic utility. But we also want to know how people evaluate their lives as a whole. And then we want to know if people have purpose or meaning in their life, a sort of Aristotelian or eudaimonic kind of well-being. And we have specific questions that measure all of these dimensions of well-being in a robust way.
Let me get Juliet's sense of it from across the pond, because your organization, I gather, has been advising the British Office of National Statistics on how to measure well-being. So how are you doing it?
Yeah, that's right. So when our Prime Minister David Cameron last year announced our national programme of measuring well-being, one of the elements he said was that he wanted to measure people's individual well-being through these sorts of subjective measures that John and Carol have been talking about. And they are being put into one of the biggest UK surveys, so we'll have them alongside all sorts of other very rich information about people's lives. And what the Office for National Statistics has decided is to use 4 key subjective wellbeing questions. So one of them is this sort of overall life evaluation question, that the type that's been most commonly used in wellbeing research, which asks people to say how satisfied they are with their lives overall. Then there are 2 mood type questions about how people's emotions, how they've been feeling. So one about how happy people have been feeling and how anxious they've been feeling, because we know that it's important to treat the positive and the negative side of that equation distinctly. And then the 4th question gets into the Aristotelian eudaimonic well-being that Carol referred to, in that it asks people whether they feel the things they do in their life are valuable. And that's, I think, really important, because we need to be able to make a link between the sorts of ways that people spend their lives and the outcome in terms of how they feel about their lives overall.
Well, David, here's I guess the key question emerging from that. If you're asking people about their feelings, how do you know they're telling you the truth, and therefore the results you're getting are worth anything?
Well, you don't. And so I think some of the measures that you can have can be not qualitative measures. You've got quantitative measures. You can measure social mobility or job creation or income levels or life expectancies and so forth. But I would like to add a caveat here. I think we're hearing a lot of smart discussion from social scientists with a very sort of social scientific point of view. Let's get lots of numbers. Let's pore over all those numbers. But part of the problem and part of the strength of GDP is that there is one number, and people can say we're winning or we're losing. And paradoxically, the success of this effort, which will come from looking at a lot of things, is actually going to come when all those things blend into one headline number again. And it's going to also be an approximation and a distortion. But at the end of the day, to cut through all the noise out there and to actually have a political effect that drives policy, you're going to have very simple metrics that say, oh, things are better this month, or they're worse this month, or you're never going to get away from GDP.
Mark, are you concerned that the information going in wouldn't be good?
A little bit concerned about that, because when you ask, I mean, if I was to ask you, Steve, how are you feeling today, you would give me how you're feeling at this moment, and really not how you're feeling over any sort of extended period of time. Some of these very direct questions that we think we ask in surveys don't measure what we hope that they will measure. And so I think we need to look at another way of approaching this. Rather, wellness and well-being really speaks to a society's values. And values, I think, are best measured by the effects that society creates, the effects that public policy create. Not the outcomes particularly, but whether the effects are those that we intend. So for example, we have an intention to create a safer society. Here in Canada, there's new legislation that criminalizes a whole bunch of things, and new omnibus bill in Canada. We need to be able to have the conversation, not whether that will have the outcome we want, but whether we have the effect of creating a safer society rather than reducing specific numbers. Numbers are abstractions. We can't get away from that. And they're very problematic because they do not capture a vast majority of things that may be unquantifiable, non-quantifiable. And those, I think, are some of the more important conversations we need to be having in a society today.
Juliet, you wanted to add?
Steve? Oh.
Well, I wanted to say that I very much agree with David's analysis, because ultimately what we're talking about is a political project. And we know that politics moves fast, and there's also always hundreds and different demands on politicians to really grab their attention and get them to use this data in their policy making. I think we do, as David said, need to have a very clear headline number that can cut through and grab public attention as well, because until the public and the electorate start putting pressure on politicians to deliver on these numbers, then it's unlikely to actually affect the way that policy making is done.
Carol Graham, I heard you trying to get in.
Yes, I wanted to jump in defense of numbers, and also to answer David in that sense that I think all of the social scientists involved in this are well aware that that for policymakers we need a simple metric and simple numbers and not hundreds of measures. But there's a lot of debate into how to there's a lot of debate about how to construct any one index that's credible. I hope we get there and think we will. But secondly, just in defense of numbers, I agree that they're abstractions. But one of the things that this method has really contributed in terms of our ability to measure quality of life in a robust way is that we can attach at least relative weights in terms of numbers about how much one thing matters to quality of life versus the other. And in terms of error and how people answer these questions, we find remarkably consistent patterns across people, across countries, and over time in terms of how they answer these questions and how those answers correlate to things we know about well-being, such as health status and education status and marital status and all kinds of other things. And I would actually argue that there's less incentive to lie to a question about your state of being or your happiness than there is in your answers to an income or expenditure survey, which is what GNP and income data is constructed from a lot of the time.
Mark, a follow-up?
Yeah, we talk about political questions and that we need numbers essentially as a club to beat politicians over the head. I mean, that's really, hold them accountable. I think we need to have a conversation about what we mean by accountable. But there is a very recent demonstration of how politicians and policymakers can be made to pay attention to things other than numbers, and that's the recent Occupy movements around the world. Politicians cannot ignore those sorts of very qualitative, very subjective expressions. And numbers like we are the 99%, which is, of course, imprecise. But more importantly, it captures headlines. It captures attention. And with people like the governor of the Bank of Canada coming out and saying he supports this movement, I think politicians cannot ignore it, even though it's not tied to a particular index numbers. So I think while numbers have their importance, we should not eliminate some very important qualitative measures of the public sentiment, how the people are feeling and the effects we create in our society.
We'd like to think that...
Can I jump,
yeah, David,
can
jump
I jump in here with one?
Sure.
Yeah, no, I at the risk of moving the conversation a step backwards, I think one of the reasons it's so useful to discuss this is that it forces us to ask the questions that often don't get posed, like why do we have a society? Why are we organizing ourselves the way that we're organizing ourselves? When you look at GDP as a measure, you say, well, the purpose of this society is to create the biggest aggregate amount of wealth that there is within a society. That suits big corporations and big financial firms, and it suits rich people who ride the waves of the society. It doesn't necessarily suit everybody else. The purpose of society is not to create aggregate wealth, it's to create better lives. And that's why we need to have metrics, because metrics then drive us in the direction of that original purpose. But we shouldn't lose sight of why we're even having this discussion.
Juliette, can I get you to jump back in here and tell us, because I think you've got your first smatterings of results, right? The Office for National Statistics has released its first test results. What have you found?
Yes, so what we found in some ways isn't very surprising. So looking at the life satisfaction measure, that comes out as on average, people rate their life satisfaction as 7.4 out of 10 on a scale of 0 to 10. And that's a similar figure as we've seen in previous years where there have been other surveys of this type in the UK. And that kind of might sound that, people are doing pretty well. People have been saying, yeah, how come that sounds pretty good when we're in a, pretty dire economic news on the news every night. But it's actually worth kind of standing back and unpicking it a little bit. Because that 7.4 is an average, and of course it masks a lot of variation. So when you look at how different groups score, we see that people living on their own score significantly lower, disabled people score lower, and particularly the unemployed come in at 6.3. And of course, we know that unemployment is set to rise here in the UK. So that looks like a message that we may well see our national well-being fall.
Can I ask John Helliwell to follow up on that? Because, of course, Canada, and we're going to see some scores in a moment, Canada fares pretty well at this. But again, it's a big country, and whether you live in a very small village in Nunavut, or whether you're living in Vancouver, British Columbia, where you are, the chances of the scores being the same are not great. Can you tell us, would you assume that the happiness index or the well-being index in British Columbia is higher than in other parts of the country? You've had the Olympics, you've got the Grey Cup champs, your hockey team went to the Stanley Cup finals. Vancouver's always considered a beautiful place to live. You think you're doing better than everybody else out there?
Well, the beauty of these data are that you don't have to assume it. We already know it. Statistics Canada, bless their hearts, have been running surveys that record these data for many years. And systematically we find that the average happiness level drops as you go from Newfoundland out to British Columbia in a smooth, steady drop that's not very large. When we unpack it, it isn't that income doesn't matter at all, and so that it does matter, but that it's overridden by a variety of social factors. People in Atlantic Canada generally, and Newfoundland in particular, they drop in on each other's places and visit. They spend more time with family and friends. The traffic salutes they give are friendly ones and not unfriendly ones. In communities that have a stable structure, where people really get a chance to know each other and do things with each other and for each other, those are where the levels are highest. So the Canadian experience is very rich in that way, that it, without denying the effects of income, it shows that the effects of these other variables can add up to more.
Okay.
And it shows you what you need to watch out for and what you need to cherish.
Indeed. As promised, let me ask you all to get comfortable for a minute or two here, because I do want to go through some rather extravagantly produced maps that we've put together here, because the Gallup organization conducted face-to-face interviews and telephone interviews with 1,000 adults in 124 different countries, and they asked them to imagine a ladder. And the rungs on this ladder are such: if you're at the very bottom of the ladder, you're a 0 and life is terrible. If you're at the top of the ladder, you're a 10 and life is bliss. How did various countries score? Let's take you through some of those right now. Well, as we suggested, Canada's at 7.4. We're doing pretty well, a little better actually than the United States, which is at 7.1. Brazil, 6.8, not bad for one of the BRIC countries. Scandinavian countries, Sweden at 7.5, Norway at 7.6. These are all pretty happy countries. Life today in Great Britain, 6.9, it says. In the Netherlands, 7.6. How about on the other end? Life today in Afghanistan is terrible. In Yemen, 3.7. Syria, thousands of people killed lately, 4.1. Central African Republic, 3.6. Mali, 3.8. That's the other end of the scale. Okay, let's continue this. I think, Michael, we've got some more on this as well. Let's do percentage of people thriving and struggling in the world. This is, again, by Gallup. They've asked a second question. People who rated their lives a 7 or higher are thriving. People who rated their lives 4 and lower are struggling. What do the maps tell us? Once again, Canada's a good place to be. 69% considered to be thriving, 10 points higher than in the United States of America. Brazil thriving at 57%. If you go once again to Europe, in Finland, they're thriving at a 64% rate. Sweden, 69. Denmark, 72, the highest number, 72% thriving. And the Netherlands, 62%. Let's go to Africa, though. Mali, thriving, 4%. Burkina Faso, 3%. Niger, 3%. Central African Republic, 2%. Chad, 1%. Okay, thank you to Gallup for those numbers. Mark, you've seen the maps, you've seen the numbers. What's the overarching inference you take from all of this?
Well, it's true money can't buy happiness, but money, I think, is what I would call a hygiene issue. If you don't have enough of it below a certain level, then you're going to be unhappy. You're going to have your life in struggle. But once you get above a certain level of hygiene of money, money doesn't motivate you. It doesn't make you any happier. Obviously, you can buy more material goods, but that's really where the money doesn't buy happiness kicks in. I think more important is economic stability. It's one's personal safety, whether you have to worry about getting up in the morning and whether you'll be able to go to sleep at night, whether you'll have enough to eat, a roof over your head, whether your village is going to be raided, and so on. So political stability is a huge indicator, as we see from the areas of the world where there isn't stability, where there isn't the basic hygiene of money and the basic hygiene of hygiene, water, food, home, peace.
Carol, Graham, any surprises for you on that list of numbers?
Not at all. I think one thing it tells us is that these metrics track things that people care about. And yes, money matters. As Mark mentioned, being destitute is terrible for any kind of well-being. And so, but the other thing, when you compare across countries, you're looking at country averages, and so you're picking up a lot of unobservable differences across countries so the income measures tell you very clearly that Mali is much worse off than Finland. That we know, and that shows up in the numbers that you cited. But when you start to compare, you had a comparison of the Netherlands and Denmark, for example, or the US and Canada, and there you get almost a flip between per capita income and what the best possible life question answers might be. And that's because they're unobservable things that come with having high levels of GDP per capita, like better quality of public goods, political freedom, all kinds of things we know and care about, and they matter to people's well-being, and those show up in those scores as well. And just a last point about the best possible life question that you have been citing from Gallup. It's a very good question, but if you look at a scatter plot of countries with the answers based on that question, average country averages, versus a scatter plot of countries with an open-ended, how happy are you with your life question, you'll find that income correlates much more closely with the best possible life question, because it's a relative question. If you ask somebody in Mali, what's the best possible life you can imagine? How does your life compare to that life? They know the best possible life isn't in Mali, and they're going to think about places like Denmark. They're going to have a global reference norm. And so you get that question correlates more closely with income than just open-ended, how happy are you with your life questions. They're measuring different things. Similar, but different things.
David, I wonder whether policymakers around the world look at these numbers and now say to themselves, we got to figure out what's going on in Denmark because they got the happiest people. What are they doing that we're not? Does that happen?
I don't know that policymakers are ever quite that thoughtful. I noticed two things in these numbers. One, on the lighter side, there seems to be a strong correlation between happiness and outside temperature. And the colder it is, the higher the happiness ratings are. So that's that might mislead policymakers. There's another factor here which it might come as a bit of a shock to some politicians and policymakers in the United States, but there does seem to be a strong correlation not just between political stability, but between the strength of the social programs that guarantee people security in their lives. A lot of the states that are scoring highest, for instance, in Northern Europe and in Scandinavia, are states that were condemned, a decade or two ago in the United States as being, social welfare states. But what's happened is, because there are strong social welfare programs, education programs, and so forth, these people have a much higher sense of security, a much lower level of anxiety. And so for policymakers looking at this, there are a lot of messages, some which they may not want to hear for political reasons.
Well, I was going to say, is that a cautionary tale to those 9 or 10 people who are running for the Republican presidential nomination today?
The 9 or 10 people running for the Republican presidential nomination today haven't a clue about the discussion that we're having, and probably would be appalled by the whole conversation.
John Hellewell, did I hear you trying to get in?
Well, I was going to say that the factors that come into play across countries are the same as those that come into play across provinces and across individuals. So the social context is really important. So yes, it is true that those Northern European countries have developed social programs, but it isn't the size of the social program so much. Some of the really happiest countries are like Switzerland, where they're small, or the Netherlands, where they're big. The real question is, and the real reason is, people trust each other and they take each other seriously and they engage with each other. And that, of course, is likely to lead to better social programs that people are happier to contribute to and less likely to abuse. But it's a much bigger package. It's the kind of lives people live when they interact with each other. And you get that, and you can get it in very undeveloped societies where it's almost a village structure, but nonetheless people have what they need and they share what they can. And they interact with each other and they're pretty happy.
Let me go back to Juliet then. The UK government is collecting and knows about these kinds of figures now. How do you see it having an impact on policies that will henceforth be brought forward?
Well, I mean, that's really the whole test of this initiative. Will it start affecting the way that policymakers make their decisions? And there are all sorts of ways which, if you take the evidence seriously, you might change policies. So John has mentioned the importance of trust and people's relationships with each other. So that's really important. So already the government here is talking about things like promoting volunteering and so on. But those might be seen as sort of nice extra to-dos, but actually there are implications for, standard macroeconomic policy. The findings from John's research and other people's about just how big a hit you get from unemployment, say, to your well-being, which goes far beyond just the loss of income, and the fact that seems to have a much bigger impact on people's well-being than something like inflation, could actually give policymakers pause for thought to think about the relative priority they give to avoiding both of those bads and perhaps adjusting their policies accordingly.
Mark, the inference I took from David's last answer was that there are some politicians in this world who think this will be far too touchy-feely, airy-fairy, and won't care a lick about it at all. What's the danger of that happening?
The danger of that happening is that we continue to live in the 17th century, or at best the 19th century. Because those systems of politics, those ways of looking at it, the boiling of everything down to a simple economic measure or a proxy of an economic measure really comes out of old thinking. We're in a world now that is far more complex, far more in relationship, far more a world in which our identity is really rolled up into how we relate with one another. So I think it's important that we begin to rethink our structures and our institutions of society. This is not going to happen from the top down. It's not going to happen from the policymakers, the politicians. Rather, we need to take an approach of social innovation where lots of people, lots of groups on the ground in direct contact with one another begin to change the way we think about organizing, about coming together, about instituting social change. In that, complexity is our friend, because small interventions in our communities, the types of initiatives that we're hearing about all over the world, where people are taking responsibility for social innovation, now begin to bubble up, and that will inform the transformation of our organizations, our governments, and eventually our politicians and policymakers. But it's up to all of us to take initiatives, each of us, one small step, one maybe little bit medium step, to create the change in our own communities, in our own companies, our own organizations, that will then enable social innovation and the types of initiatives that we're hearing about around the world to really take hold, and for politicians then to notice.
Well, Carol, forgive my curiosity about how Washington works, but again, David suggested that the people seeking the presidential nomination for the Republicans are just not attuned to this. Do you see any evidence that the Obama administration is hip to this?
Well, I think the Obama administration has so many very large and pressing issues on its mind right now that I think, at the sort of big macro level, probably not. But I do think that there are pockets of interest. I mean, Alan Kruger, who's the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, has been one of the people that pioneered time use surveys, the measurement of how people use their time and how that correlates with their well-being. There are others. I think there's certainly interest and some sympathy towards it. I also would like to echo the sort of bottom-up point, though, in the sense that once the data gets into the public domain, as it will and has been in Britain, that will in and of itself generate momentum, because people are going to ask questions. If it's in the public domain that unemployment matters that much more to well-being than does an additional increment of income, that in the end will generate or force politicians to deal with the information. At least that's my view.
Less than 2 minutes to go here. David Rothkopf, do you think the current economic crisis in which we as a planet find ourselves in offers in some ways an opportunity to rethink the way we've always done things?
I hope it does. I hope the crisis is big enough for us to say, gee, this system is broken in a fundamental way and we need to fix it in a fundamental way, whether that's restructuring the European Union or even more deeply looking at some of these core issues about how we measure our success and who benefits and how that success is spread throughout society. But I do think another corollary point that's been brought up here again and again and again is that quality of life is a result of a collaboration between government, business, and individuals. It happens at every level in society, and these metrics need to have an effect not just on politicians or on business leaders, but on average people, because we need to sort of knit the fabric of society together and lift up together in order to get up to the next level.
And John Helliwell, let me give you the last 20 seconds just to talk about the Canadian experience. Do you think our federal government at the moment is adequately seized of this new way of looking at things?
I don't think so, but here I think in Canada the action is starting at the local level and in some provinces, and that communities are now even doing. Victoria, for example, has already run surveys at the municipal and regional level there. Citizens are focusing on the data, trying to find out ways in which communities can connect with each other to make lives better. So it's spreading pretty fast, but so far not without central buy-in from Ottawa.
I want to thank all of you for participating in this program, particularly given the logistical difficulties of having a thoughtful discussion in 4 different cities on 2 different continents, but you all did great. Juliette Michelson in London, UK, Carol Graham and David Rothkopf in Washington, D.C., John Helliwell in Vancouver, BC, Mark Fetterman here in our studio in Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate your time tonight.